here. This is the homestead of the Craigheads. They spent summers here. They ran through the woods. They learned their plants and owls and animals. And it has been passed on through the years. And then in the last 10 years, 15 years, a really remarkable group of volunteers decided it was time to save the house. It was about ready to fall into the basement. And I would like to point out, can you guys raise your hand? And everybody here, they put love, sweat, everything into this house. It was a mess, and they did all the beautiful, work, and did the walls and matched the color of the wood, and did the gardens, and it's just incredible what you guys have done. And today, after the talk, there will be docents here who can take you on a tour of the house and take you around. So that's really cool. It's their second tour, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's
Second, third tour.
Yeah. If anybody would like to take the tour, please meet out on the porch. We'll get started out there.
But the main reason we're here today is because my little brother is here to talk about the year, the time he went to Alaska with my mother, who was Jean Craighead George, who wrote Julie of the Wolves, when she began to do her research on the book. He has done his PhD research in Mexico, down in Loreto, and on what birds? Land birds. Land birds. And then went on to teach at Humboldt State, where he did research in songbirds in the forests. And was a great teacher. I've talked to a lot of students. He really was a great teacher. And then moved to Colorado, Fort Collins, and now he's at Colorado State, and he is what are you?
I'm a faculty member in the Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at Colorado State.
And he just finished a really cool project where it was kids from different areas, and they went up into the mountains and they studied for a month with 125 kids, and they lived up there and did the work and did the research, and now we've got him here on his way to a high school reunion. So I won't tell any bad stories about it.
Thanks, Trey. Well, that's a first to be introduced by a sibling. That's pretty special. Before I want to get started on my talk, I just feel like I need to acknowledge what happened here in Pennsylvania yesterday when Donald Trump was nearly killed by a sniper. And I just hope we can get past our divisions and pull together, because we've got so many big issues that we have to face, and if we can't do it together, we're just not going to be able to solve them. So I just wanted to at least acknowledge that, because it's certainly something that's had a big impact on me. And
did you know the sniper was a Republican?
I did hear that. And you know what? It doesn't matter who he was. That kind of violence, we just can't have it, or we can't keep our democracy. And yeah, I just want to acknowledge what Twig said as well about the folks that have pulled this Craighead house together. Because I was here about 30 years ago, and it was literally, you were scared walking up the stairs because you weren't sure if they were going to hold. And those old drawings were still on the wall, and there was still the spirits that had been here in this house, but it was looking like it was just going to fall into the ground. And the work that they put into restoring this, and bringing educational groups here, and kind of bringing the legacy of the Craighead family back into this area has been really remarkable. So I just want to acknowledge that. And I also want to acknowledge that they pulled this together very quickly for my talk. I just mentioned to Twig that I was coming back for a high school reunion. She said, "Oh, well, Craighead House might want to have you come over and talk if you feel like it." So I thought, sure, why not? And then I had to think about, oh gosh, what can I say that folks here haven't already heard before? And the one story that I thought I could talk about that I had some direct experience with was how my mom went about collecting the information that she used for writing Julie of the Wolves. And I'll try to give you a feel for that as I go along. But you know, the story really starts here in Alexandria, Virginia, where Mom grew up with her two twin older brothers. And I know a lot of you here know a lot about their legacy. Very, very well-known biologists, studied grizzly bears in Yellowstone, and early in their career were very well-known falconers that introduced the whole art of falconry into many areas of the United States. And they were like amazing, right? They published articles in National Geographic when they were still teenagers. They had a book about hawks and the hawks that they had raised that they published in their 20s. And during World War II, the Navy recruited them to write a book called How to Survive on Land and Sea, which was a survival manual for Navy personnel that might have found themselves stranded in the ocean or on an isolated island, because they knew so much about how to live off the land. And you can imagine, my mom was 3 years younger, and these two were just larger than life symbols that were adored by the community and her family. And so it was hard for her to get her voice heard. I mean, she had to really step forward to have herself recognized by her family. And if any of you have read her book, Summer of the Falcon, that was set here in this house during her childhood. And she makes it clear that it was not an easy thing to negotiate growing up under the shadow of these two people. And here's a picture of Mom standing in the kitchen right over here. A number of the drawings on the wall there are hers, and of course she's an incredible artist as well as a very good writer. And the other aspect that isn't as well known about her is that she was a really, really good natural historian. I remember taking walks with her in the woods in New York where we grew up, and she would know every plant. You would point at something, oh yeah, that's so-and-so sassafras or whatever, and could tell you how it was used or whatever. And even as I went and got my degrees and my PhD, and I would come back and visit, I was continually amazed by how much information she retained about, especially about the plants and animals in that area. The impetus for writing Julie of the Wolves really came about during the 1960s when our views of wolves started changing. So prior to that time, wolves were portrayed in children's stories and in the literature as sort of bloodthirsty killers that the only way to make communities and livestock safe was to exterminate them. And it was about 1945 when Adolph Murray studied the wolves in Mount McKinley National Park, now Denali, that people started recognizing that, wow, there's actually more to the wolf behavior than we thought. He documented that in many packs there were multiple adults that would live together. There would always just be two breeding individuals in the pack, but the other members of the pack would help raise the pups, even though they weren't their own direct descendants. And he also pointed out that unlike the portrayal of them just being sort of these aggressive animals that were constantly battling one another, that most of the time when you'd watch a wolf pack, they would be interacting like this. There would be very little aggression, a lot of appeasement behaviors and so on. And he also pointed out that the alpha wolf was basically the leader of the pack. And whatever that wolf decided was basically how the pack followed. And the last thing he pointed out was, again, it was thought that wolves were decimating wildlife populations, and that in order to maintain populations of elk and deer, that the only way to do that was to get rid of wolves. And it was Murray who pointed out that, gosh, actually, the wolves are not very successful hunters. They only kill an animal about once out of every 15 tries. And it was usually the older, the sick, or the very young individuals. So completely turned the idea of the big bad wolf on its head, where it was now recognized that wolves were actually an important part of maintaining healthy ungulate populations. And without them, that disease and other things would spread through a lot of these packs or a lot of these herds. And just to kind of bring this up to the present day, we just released wolves in Colorado, and we have a disease in the elk and deer there called chronic wasting disease. And there have been studies that have shown now that the wolves will preferentially kill animals that are infected with chronic wasting disease. And this is probably a very effective way to try to reduce the proportion of infected animals in the population. So, these studies and many others really changed our perception about the wolves and their relationship to the ecosystems that they lived in. And there's a couple of quotes that I think are particularly relevant. This one's from Adolf Murray. The strongest impression remaining with me after watching the wolves was their friendliness towards each other. So again, a complete change from what we had thought. The wolf was the one animal that, again, did two things at once, year after year: remained distinct and exemplary as an individual, yet served the tribe. That was Barry Lopez of Men and Wolves. And then David Meach, who had studied wolves for many decades in Isle Royale and Minnesota, kind of summed it up. The wolf is neither man's competitor nor enemy. He's a fellow creature with whom the earth must be shared. And so as these ideas were changing, my mom's editor at the Reader's Digest said, I think we need an article about wolves and sort of the changing view of wolves. And a lot of people aren't aware, because we think of the Reader's Digest as a digest, right, of articles from other magazines. But the Reader's Digest actually had a full staff of very, very good writers. And Mom was one of their most prolific nature writers. I think she wrote over 200 articles for the Reader's Digest, which is just amazing. And what people don't recognize is that the Digest would send their writers out to write an article. They would place it in another magazine, Field and Stream or Atlantic or whatever. And then before they had actually published it, they had a condensed version ready to go into Reader's Digest. So they weren't just grabbing things from everybody else. They were creating most of the content that went into the magazine. And in 1968, it had a circulation of about 18 million per month. And, they were in every dentist's office. Probably those of you my age, right, remember seeing Reader's Digest and pick it up. In a few minutes, you could read 3 or 4 articles. And so, DeWitt Wallace really had a pretty, amazing vision of how he could pull this all together. So when Mom's editor came to her, she loved that idea, and she started immediately looking into where she should go to get information about wolves. Because one thing she always did when she was undertaking a writing project is she went to the area where she was going to write about, because she wanted to learn about the animals, and she wanted to learn about the ecosystem that they were a part of. And that was something she always tried to do in her books and other writing, is to give a sense of place where these animals lived. So there were two places that were high on our radar. One was Barrow, Alaska, now known as Utqiagvik, because there was studies going on there of captive wolves that were ongoing at that time. And then the other spot was Mount McKinley National Park, where Gordon Haber was doing some studies of wild wolves. And as soon as I heard that Mom might be going to Alaska, my radar really went up, because turns out I was 13 at the time. I think on the flyer it says I was 12, but I remember now, back in those days they would give a discount for kids when they were flying. I don't know if any of you remember. Parents would pay one thing and the kids would pay less. And so Mom figured out that if she took the first class ticket that the Reader's Digest had given her to fly to Alaska, turned it in, she could pay for 2 tickets and get me up there. And I was just crazy about fishing at that time. And all I knew about Alaska was that there were these great big salmon and trout that were ready for the picking. And so I was all on board when she asked if I wanted to go along. So we first flew to SeaTac Airport in Washington, and then I have a couple of loops here. So this first loop, what happened is we took off from SeaTac at night, and we got almost to Anchorage, and the pilot came on and said, "We seem to have a little problem with our landing gear. We're going to turn around and fly back to Seattle, because they have better emergency equipment there." So we turned around, flew all the way back, and we landed on this runway that was lined with fire trucks with their lights on, and emergency vehicles. And I woke up and I looked out the window. I said, "Oh, are we in Anchorage?" And Mom said, "No! We came all the way back to Seattle. You slept through all that?" Anyway. Yeah, it was exciting. It turns out it was just the sensor was wrong. Landing gear was fine, so we fixed the light and turned around and went back. But flew into Anchorage, and then that yellow line is we took the train from Anchorage to Fairbanks, which is an amazing trip. If you ever go to Alaska, I recommend it. And then from Fairbanks, we flew up to Barrow, or Utqiagvik. But before talking about that, just a little context. Something that was happening right at that time was a big debate in Alaska about the transatlantic pipeline system. Ironically, it was named TAPS. And so you would see these big piles of oil pipes, and some of the environmental activists would run up to them and write TAPS for Alaska. And there was a lot of controversy about whether they could even physically build this pipeline across the state. It was 800 miles long, up over high mountain passes, across big rivers like the Yukon. And probably one of the biggest engineering issues they had to deal with was building a pipeline that was carrying hot oil across the permafrost of northern Alaska. Frozen ground, which if you melt it, will just turn into a quagmire. So there was lots and lots of concern about whether they could do this safely, and there was just kind of a general back and forth within the state about whether they should move forward with this and bring all the riches that would come with developing the oil, or stay the rural, sleepy state that they had been. And there was a lot of controversy on both sides. And just to give you a sense of Barrow or Utqiagvik and how isolated it is, this is what we call the North Slope of Alaska. It's an area about the size of the state of Utah. This is the Brooks Range, northernmost range in Alaska, and everything from here north is basically flat rolling tundra. So very featureless plain from the Brooks Range up to the ocean. And there was nothing in there at this time. It was complete wilderness, no roads, very few small villages through the area. And it was across here. Prudhoe Bay is right over here. So they were gonna build the pipeline right to the right of where my arrow is here. So, just through complete wilderness. And it was really remarkable flying across that as we flew up to Barrow, because you'd look down and you just wouldn't see anything for hundreds of miles. When we got there, one of the first things we did is, after we checked into the top of the world hotel, which didn't have any running water at that time, Mom wanted to get out on the tundra, and again, to just kind of see the plants that occurred there and get a sense of it. And so we put on our boots, and she had gotten this beautiful Eskimo parka. Because the other thing that was really clear is that the clothes that we brought just weren't up to the task of staying warm. Even in July, up there in Barrow, between the wind and the humidity, it just kind of seeped right through you. And this just shows, the notes that Mom took while we were up there. Barrow, 71 degrees, 23 minutes north latitude, 300 miles north of the Arctic Circle. So just trying to get a sense of place. Low, flat Arctic coastal plain, drainage poor because of flatness and permafrost, tundra not luxurious, low sedges and grasses interspersed with a few forbs. So, trying to get set the scene here. And then she lists all the bird species that we encountered: snow bunting, lapwing, longspur. And, I'm an ornithologist, and looking at this list that she wrote, I'm amazed. I mean, these aren't birds that are, like your common backyard birds, right? These are things that are hard to identify. Ruddy turnstone, pectoral sandpiper, Baird sandpiper, dunlins, all shorebirds that are fairly similar to one another. So again, just her ability to, just walk into an area and kind of get a sense of it so quickly was really amazing. The reason that we were going to Barrow was because of the Naval Arctic Research Lab. And I should mention Dr. Tom Albert is here, who spent decades up in Barrow and working on what Gnarl evolved into. And this place has had a profound effect on the Eskimo community in northern Alaska. And I won't go into it here, but suffice it to say that the Navy set up a research laboratory because they were interested in surviving in the Arctic environment, and submarines were starting to go under the North Pole at that time. And there was potential for warfare up there, so they developed this lab to look at both human responses to the Arctic, but also looking at Arctic animals. And they had game pens there where they kept, there was a polar bear that was kept in captivity, a pack of wolves, some wolverines, Arctic foxes, a lot of the species that occur in that environment. And another thing that Mom always tried to do when she was preparing a book is to try to get a sense of the individual personalities of the animals of the species that we were studying. And that was part of the reason that we had so many animals in our house growing up. And Twig has talked about, you know, what it was like to grow up with 173 wild animals over our early childhood years. But you learn things about animals when they're with you 24/7 that you don't learn by even watching them in the wild or studying their behavior in captivity. So she really wanted to go up to Gnarl because they had a captive wolf pack that Dr. Michael Fox was working on. There was another professor there, Dr. Folk, who was looking at the heart rate of the alpha males. And one thing that really made an impression on Mom is Dr. Folk was putting a heart monitor on the alpha wolf in the pack. And he would put the alpha wolf with the most subordinate omega wolf in the pack, and heart rate would be very low and steady, and the alpha male, you know, just seemed to be very, very calm. When he would move him back into the cage, the outdoor cage with the entire pack, immediately his heart rate would go up, and it would stay up for the entire time that he was with the pack. And she saw that as like a kind of an indication that this animal recognized its role as a leader of the pack, and that when it was in the presence of those pack animals, that it was kind of on high alert all the time, similar to a leader of you know, human society. So that really influenced how she thought about the wolves in the wolf pack. The other neat thing is that we got to go in and spend some time with the wolves, and I just want to read this passage from the foreword that Twig and Craig and I wrote a few years ago. After returning from our hike, we went to the animal pens at Gnarl and watched a captive female wolf interact with her young, the other wolves, and the researchers. We had been invited by Dr. Michael Fox, who was an expert in wolf behavior and was studying captive wolves. Dr. Fox explained that when the female looked at Mom directly, it meant she would accept her, that Mom would be part of her pack. For days, the wolf, while calm and friendly, did not look at Mom, but during one of her last visits, the female turned and looked at her. Her golden eyes connected with my mother's, and she was accepted. It was a moment Mom never forgot. And again, it was just kind of being in close proximity with the animals so that she could get a sense of what they were like. Now I'm going to go up one. One thing I meant to point out here is there was another thing that we wrote about Mom's kind of reaction to first seeing the tundra and how it might have influenced Julie of the Wolves. And I'll kind of come back to this in a little bit. She said, we started out from Gnarl with our borrowed parkas and walked inland looking at plants, birds, and frost heaves. After walking for a few hours, we turned to head back to Gnarl, but a fog bank had enveloped us. The tundra looked the same in every direction. And this is me from my perspective now. I looked at Mom and she looked at me. We pointed in opposite directions and said, I think we go that way. And that was literally true. I felt my stomach sink. We were alone on the tundra, the weather was turning, and we had little food, no shelter, and no idea which way to go. And this is just completely flat, featureless environment. At that point, Mom calmly said, let's sit down and eat some gorp and wait for the fog to clear. In less than an hour, the DEW stations, these are Defense Early Warning Radar stations, because this is still Cold War era, and missiles from Russia were likely to come to the US through over Alaska, so they had a whole series of radar stations up there. Located along the coast, emerged from the fog, and we quickly found our way back. Mom may have been thinking of that moment when she wrote, and this is from Julie of the Wolves. She had been lost without food for many sleeps on the north slope of Alaska. The view in every direction is exactly the same. And yeah, I just remember still to this day just being chilled by this prospect that we have no idea which way we're supposed to go. And yeah, just to add to this, I was hoping that I could take this wolf pup home. We bonded, but we learned that wolves, keeping them in a house is pretty tough. That if they decide they want to see what's inside a couch, they'll just rip the couch apart. And oftentimes they'll try to bring things back to the house, and so they'll go and raid neighbors' yards and take whatever they have and bring it back. And so it doesn't really work very well to keep a wolf, especially in New York. The other thing that is, as I was going back and looking through her notes that she took when we were up there, was just how deeply she delved into the scientific literature. So I have underlined here, ecological relations of Jaeger's owls, Petelka et al. And again, I went and got my PhD in ornithology. I knew Frank Petelka. He was a giant in the ornithological world. And so it was just amazing to me to see her citing this, and she cited it correctly. If I could get my students to do that, I would feel so much better. And she would read these articles. I mean, after, as a kid growing up, I didn't really pay attention, but after she died, going through her books, looking at the marginal notes and all of these scientific publications that she read, it was clear she plowed through this stuff and learned it, and it was pretty remarkable. One, of course, big aspect of Julie of the Wolves was the Inupiat culture and the conflicts between the changing culture and the new money that was coming into the area from the oil development versus the traditional way that they had always done things. But the interesting thing is thinking back on it, we met with some of the Eskimo whalers in the town and some of the leaders. They heard that Mom was writing an article about wolves and wanted to share some of their information. But at that point, Mom wasn't thinking of writing a book. She was just thinking of writing an article. And so it wasn't as if she was reading a lot of information and delving into that. I'll tell you about that in a minute in terms of how she got into writing Julie of the Wolves. But I certainly remember spending time in one of the one-room homes where one of the Eskimo whalers lived, and sitting on top of big furs while his wife was sewing up mukluks and mittens and so on. And at the same time, there was a TV in the corner and a toaster over on the other counter. So it was a real mixture of kind of the old and new happening right then. Another thing I think back on and just go, what was she thinking? We'd been up in Barrow for about a week or more, and then it was time to go back down and visit Gordon Haber. And there was this guy that we met who piloted his own plane. And he said, well, gosh, I'll fly you back to Fairbanks. I think, flying in Alaska is not, you gotta know what you're doing. Mom was like, sure, okay. And so we piled him his plane, and he flew us back along the route that the transatlantic pipeline was gonna take, or trans-Alaskan. And it was really pretty remarkable because we saw some places as we went over the Brooks Range where bulldozers were bulldozing the road, but they had broken the permafrost and caused the permafrost to melt. And then literally these giant D9 cats were just sliding down hillsides into the rivers below. So it just really impressed on me not only how prodigious this project was going to be, but just how difficult it was going to be to really make it work. So then we had a few days between getting back to Fairbanks and going up to Mount Denali. And this is where I was like, yes, I get to go fishing. And we camped for a few days along the way. And we went, I distinctly remember we went into a restaurant, and when the waitress came up and talked to us, Mom said, oh, you know, my son really wants to go fishing. Do you have any places around here where you could go catch a salmon? And she stood up and she said, you cannot fish for salmon in any of these streams around here. These are spawning streams. These animals are here to lay their eggs and carry on the next generation. You cannot fish. I was kind of like, okay, I guess I'm not going to catch my first salmon. So I fished for grayling, and I fished in some other places. I did not catch a fish on my first trip to Alaska, and that was a huge disappointment. But there were some other pretty amazing things we saw. So we met with Gordon Haber. He was a PhD student then. He was studying wolves in Mount McKinley, some of the same packs that Adolph Murray had studied. And this actually is not far from one of the places where we stop and watch a wolf pack that was around a den. And this was in July. So when the pups are first born, they're in what they call the natal den for about 6 weeks until they start moving around more. And then the pack moves to another den where they have more entrances and more ability to move around. And this particular pack had picked up and moved about a week or two before we got there. So Gordon thought it would be fine to go out and visit the den site itself, because he thought there's no way they're coming back. So we walked out there. It was a few miles off of the road to get to it. No trails, just hiking along game trails. And this was Mom's sketch of what it looked like from the perspective of the wolf den. And she writes, where is it? Somewhere, a kingdom of 600, maybe it's not.
It's in the lower left.
Lower left, there we go. A kingdom of 400 moose, 600 tall sheep. So this was just sort of like their domain, right? And Gordon had talked about how he watched a pack of wolves ascend a 1,800 foot, almost vertical wall in 18 minutes, and just sort of indicating their ability to move across these huge landscapes really, really fast. And then I just have to point this out. That's my feeble attempt at drawing a wolf track. So I was talking to Gordon Haber about, well, how do you recognize a wolf track and differentiate it from bear and everything else? And so he gave me some pointers, and I did my best to do it, but you can tell that my artistic abilities were not nearly as good as my mom's. And she would do these kinds of drawings wherever she would go. She would just sit down with her pen, and in a few minutes she would have the whole scene sketched out. It was amazing. And I'm sure that also helped her just kind of solidify, what these landscapes look like. And here's her depiction of the wolf den itself. So this is the entrance to the wolf den right there. And for these nursing dens, they just had one entrance. They didn't have an exit going out anywhere else. And Gordon would talk about how as the adult wolves would come home, they'd all stop and listen at the entrance, for the pups. And if everything was fine, their tails would start wagging and they go off and lay down. Gordon actually asked me if I would climb into the den because he wanted to get measurements of how deep and how far it went. And I was little, but I was not willing to climb. It was just too claustrophobic. I mean, it was really tight. So I let him down on that one. But as we were sitting there, we were
You're
looking.
still alive, so that's good.
I am, yeah, just barely. As we were sitting there, we were looking down over the valley, and I'm pretty sure it was Mom who saw the grizzly bear walking along the game trail that we had come up to the den on. And she turned to Gordon and said, "There's a bear coming. I think we better wait to go back." And he looked at the bear and he looked at the trail. He said, no, we gotta go now. We gotta get down to the trail ahead of the bear, because the last thing we want is for the bear to get ahead of us on the trail and maybe sleep in the willows. It was a really, really dense willow thicket along the creek. And if we came up on and surprised the bear, it would be really dangerous. So we wanted to get ahead of it. So we just sprinted down to the creek and got ahead of them. Well, so what happened? Mom got back to Chappaqua, pitched her story to the editor, and said, oh, guess what? We've already got somebody to write the wolf article. And it turns out it was David Meach, who's a wolf biologist, who, as I mentioned, studied wolves in Isle Royale, has written a book about wolves. And in December of 1970, the Reader's Digest published his article called In Defense of the Wolf. And again, it was this idea that we had been thinking about wolves in the wrong way all along, and we really needed to start changing our perspective. So as you can imagine, that was kind of devastating for Mom, because she had all this great information and she didn't really know what to do with it. She knew that she had something good, but she wasn't sure how she was going to get it out. And so again, from the foreword that we wrote, this is now from Twig's perspective. She said, I got a call from Mom and she sounded upset. The Digest had rejected her wolf article. She sounded very discouraged because she thought it was one of her best pieces. Twig says, why don't you write a book? I asked. She paused, and with her Jean George determination, she said, I will. And that was really the origin of Julie of the Wolves. But again, I mentioned that when we were up in Alaska, our whole focus was on the wolf. And of course, Julie of the Wolves has the whole dimension of the native culture and integrating into this new world. And so I have to say I'm completely ignorant of how Mom kind of got up to speed on the Inupiaq culture, because she didn't go back to Alaska. I'm sure she read books about it, but if you read Julie of the Wolves, she includes some of the Inupiaq names for animals in the book and for different people, and so she obviously got up to speed very quickly. And this, we found after she died, this was the original draft of Julie of the Wolves, and her titles that she was trying at that time were Wolf Girl and Cry of the Wolf. And I don't know if it would have gotten the Newbery Award if it would have been called Wolf Girl, maybe. But then eventually evolved into Julie of the Wolves. The other thing that we found when we were going through her things was the first letter that she got from her editor at HarperCollins about the draft. And again, as a scientist reading through that, it was like a complete gut punch. I mean, that editor ripped her up one side, down the other, said this was, there was maybe some material that could be used, but it had to be completely rewritten, that she didn't like this perspective, that perspective. I thought to myself, if I had gotten that letter, I would have curled up in a ball and just, gone in the bottom of the closet and probably not come out for a week. But Mom, with her indomitable spirit, and I think partly forged by her time with her brothers here, was just like, no, I don't care what you think. I'm gonna push ahead with this book. And so I looked at, this is the first draft that she had sent to the editor, and over on the right here is what was actually published. And you can see that several lines, lines of the book are word for word what she wrote in her first draft. So she basically told the editor to stuff it and that she was gonna go ahead with her ideas. So the book was published in '72, and again, this was remarkably fast to put a book together. And Mom was just amazing that way, that she could get an idea in her head and boom, the next day she would be at the typewriter hammering things out. Of course it won the Newbery Award in 1973, sold over 3 million copies, 13 languages, 2 sequels. So just, a really remarkable success. And this meant a lot to her. Her book, My Side of the Mountain, had been a Newbery Honors book back in 1960, but she had never gotten recognition as being, one of the foremost children's book writers. So for her to get this was really, really special. And of course it had a big impact on her. So kind of finishing up here, I want to come back to some of the themes in the book. So this is, Julie had these songs that she would sing when she was out on the tundra to kind of keep herself going. And this was the very last one on the last page of the book. It says, the seals are scarce and the whales are almost gone. The spirits of the animals are passing away. Amarak, Amarak, that was the alpha male wolf of the pack that had befriended her and saved her from starving when she was out on the tundra. You are my adopted father. My feet dance because of you. My eyes see because of you. My mind thinks because of you. I'm getting a little emotional. And it thinks on this thundering night that the hour of the wolf and the Eskimo is over. And I remember reading that the first time and just feeling really, again, just sort of knocked over. But in looking at the ending of the first draft, it was clear that what she meant here is that not so much that wolves were going to disappear and Eskimos were going to go away, but the old traditional ways were passing on. But she also recognized that the Eskimo culture was very, very adept at incorporating new elements into their culture and maintaining kind of old ways while at the same time, accepting some of the new ways as well. And for years afterwards, after wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park, Mom would go out and watch them. And this was her good friend, Barbara Dana. They would go up to Lamar Valley and sit there for hours watching the wolves run back and forth. She also, my brother, moved up to Barrow, Alaska. This was about, he first went up to Barrow in 1977, and then ended up going back and staying there in 1980 and raising a family and living there for over 40 years. And so Mom would go up there a lot and visit with him and go out on the ice and count whales and do things. The other thing that she really loved was visiting with the school children virtually everywhere, but this is in Barrow, Alaska, and talking to them about the wolves and the ecosystem. And another thing she would do, which was really remarkable, is she would bring a drawing pad up and just hang it up, and she would just, in a few seconds have a picture of a wolf, and boom, it would just light up the place, and the kids were just mesmerized by it. But she had a really, really tight relationship with many, many people in the town of Barrow. And this is a picture my cousin took of Mom in her favorite place, one of her favorite places anyway. That's her office. Looked out onto her backyard there in Chappaqua, New York. And of course, she went on to write 2 sequels for Julie of the Wolves, as well as many, many other books after she wrote Julie of the Wolves. So she stayed active for basically until our last day, writing and being involved. And certainly, the ideas that she put forward in her books had an impact. In 1970, nobody was talking about reintroducing wolves into Yellowstone National Park. But 26 years later, that's what happened. And now just last year, wolves were reintroduced into Colorado. So, you know, despite that kind of dire prediction of the wolves being over, the wolves are coming back because of real powerful stories like Julie of the Wolves and other things. So this is a picture I took in 2021. This wolf, my brother and I went and we were doing a river trip on the Coopard River, which starts at the base of the Brooks Range and flows north to the Arctic Ocean. And I had been pushing him for a while to do this trip, and he finally said, okay, let's go do it. And so it was his family and my son and I all went. And the first night, this wolf showed up on the other side of the river. And for like 10 minutes, was just walking slowly along the other side of the river and stopping and just kind of, you know, really keeping an eye on us the whole time. And Craig and I thought, that's Mom. That's Mom's spirit. She was making sure that we knew that she was watching us and that we better not screw up on this trip.
You sure it's not a dog?
Yeah, I'm sure it's not a dog. We were hundreds of miles from any settlements at that point. And I'll just finish up with kind of where I started with Mom and her brothers. You know, they didn't always have a real easy relationship. And John and Frank were kind of revered as these conservation heroes and scientists that studied birds of prey and grizzly bears and all kinds of things. And for many years, they were pretty hard on Mom. They kind of poo-pooed the children's books that she wrote as, you know, just kind of like not as important as the work that they were doing. And I remember her really being upset a few times by things that she said. And I remember one time in particular, this was even kind of perpetrated by her mother and father. My grandfather was being honored by people in Florida because he had moved down there and written a book on the ecology of southern Florida. And the governor came for the celebration, and my grandmother and grandfather introduced John and Frank to the governor. Mom was right there, and they didn't say anything. And it just kind of brought back that hurt that she felt, you know, throughout, that she just didn't get the recognition she deserved. But both John and Frank, to their credit, as they got older, both independently came to Mom and said, you know, the stories that you write are really powerful. You know, we might collect the data, you know, do the analyses and find out information, but without the stories, the information that we gather really doesn't have an impact. And it was her books that I think changed a lot of people's attitudes about wolves, wilderness, natural systems, and we have a lot to thank her for. So, thanks. So I don't know how we want to do things. If I'm happy to answer questions, but I don't know how long you want this to go. Okay, yeah, so folks, if they have to go, feel free. Otherwise, hang around.
I was curious that she didn't illustrate the cover of the book that you showed. Why didn't she?
Yeah, right, because she had illustrated most of her books prior to that. She realized that illustrating was a lot of time and effort and not much to pay for it. So she decided right around then that she wouldn't be illustrating her books anymore, except for when she wrote sequels to My Side of the Mountain. She did the illustrations to keep it consistent with what had been before. But yeah, at that point she decided I'm in 100% on writing and course, John Schoner did the illustrations for Julie of the Wolves, and he is a remarkable wildlife illustrator. So it didn't lose anything.
Even the Caldecott,
Oh.
which is sort of the Newberry of the illustrators.
Yeah. So he won the Caldecott for which?
For Al Moon.
Oh yeah. How many of you know Al Moon? Yeah. Another amazing book. Yeah. So yeah.
Could you help us out with some of the pronunciations of the names in the book?
So like Amarok,
What
that's
about, is it Miax
Oh.
or Miax? How do you say her name?
Mayax, I think is how I've always pronounced it, but don't quote me.
Okay.
Tom Albert might know better some of those pronunciations, but yeah. Like I say, that whole aspect of the book, I wasn't really a part of,
Right.
because she did that all after her trip. Yeah.
Where in Colorado have the wolves been reintroduced?
Oh, so in the proposition that was passed, it was required that they be reintroduced onto the west slope of Colorado. So Continental Divide goes through the state, had to be west of that, but of course, wolves move a lot, and they've already moved over the divide and there was one that, this is remarkable, was killed by a mountain lion about 40 miles north of Fort Collins. So they had come over the divide. It was a lone wolf. If it had been a pack, it would have been the opposite result. But yeah, they've spread all over, but all the introductions will be on the west side. There's more open space there, more national forest land, and
So that's like Rocky Mountain National Park?
Rocky Mountain is on the east side. Most of it, there's maybe a bit of it that crosses over the Continental Divide. But so yeah, they won't be reintroduced into Rocky Mountain, but I'm sure they'll be there soon if they haven't gotten there already. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know if they've crossed I-70 yet? The last report I saw was that they had not crossed the interstate yet.
Right. Yeah, that's my information too. So what Colorado Parks and Wildlife has done, they put radio collars on all the wolves that they reintroduced in December. And they're trying to balance the need for the public to know where they are versus trying to protect the wolves. Because I don't know if any of you've heard about what happened with the wolf in Wyoming this spring. Just a horrible, horrible story. I won't repeat it, but they want to let people generally know where they are, so they will just indicate watersheds that wolves have passed through, and that the radios have indicated they occurred in. And a couple of those watersheds pass a little bit below I-70, but they made it clear that the wolves actually have not crossed I-70. So that's going to be interesting, because the next reintroduction in December of this year will be, I believe they'll be south of I-70. And so whether or not those wolves will exchange, move from one area to the other is an open question. I mean, I-70 is a pretty formidable barrier across a lot of that area. So yeah, that'll be interesting. Yeah.
Just wanted to let you know, I got a text here a moment ago from a young lady in Barrow, and she said your mom, she had a very difficult, troubled life. She said your mom coming to school, she thinks she may have been in that picture you showed. She said that was one of the few bright spots of her life growing up in Barrow.
Wow.
Your mom coming, and she would look forward to the next book fair, because the school would time it, your mom would time it to be there with book fairs.
Wow.
Letter from Amber.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for, so that's Neil George, by the way, my half-brother. And this, that makes me think about this letter that Mom got from a woman in Barrow. She said, "Dear Mrs. Jean Craighead George, more than 10 years before I was born, You wrote a story that resonates within me 40 years later. Julie of the Wolves is more than a book to me. It is a girl that has broken the trail for me. Inupiaq names are links to ancestral spirits that lived before us. My family gave me the Inupiaq name of Mayak, or Mayaks, in 1985, and raised me in Julie's hometown of Barrow, Alaska. Much like me, Julie imagines the life beyond Barrow. She is running with both from and to something at the same time. Julie is strong enough to risk everything she knows for the chance of a better world, but she also is humble enough to find strength in her Inupiaq heritage and the lessons from her ancestors. I open your book at a moment in my life when I was struggling to release the grasp of my family and community had on my soul. I yearned for more than Barrow, but I needed someone to share the heartache of leaving home behind. I found it in your words and my namesake. Our Creator used you to remind me that I am not alone, and I am thankful to you. Most sincerely, Maya. So, yeah.
And she's still a friend of the family.
Yeah, she had an impact on a lot of people.
Okay.
I'm good?
Yeah.
Okay.